King Felipe II of Spain, the Lord of the Netherlands, had died. His 20-year-old son, King Felipe III, was now stuck dealing with the Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands, who had been waging a war against the Spanish realm for 3 decades now. Before his passing, his father had put Felipe's sister, the Infanta Isabel, and her husband, Archduke Albrecht of Austria, in charge of all 17 states of the Netherlands. They would all work together to get the 7 rebellious states back into the Spanish realm. Count Moritz von Nassau was the Captain General and Admiral of the United States Armies and Navies. He was the 30-year-old second son of Prince Willem of Orange, who had started the war 30 years ago. Maurits could rely on many experienced generals and officers, among them his cousins, Counts Wilhelm Ludwig, Ernst Casimir, and Ludwig Günther von Nassau. The Stadtholder was also training his 14-year-old half-brother, Count Frederik Hendrik of Nassau, in the fine art of warfare. Maurits and Willem Lodewijk had drastically reorganized and retrained the Dutch rebel army. Over the past 9 years, they'd taken many cities and forts with highly scientific siege techniques and significantly increased the size of the Republic. Military campaigns were organized and paid for by the sovereign. In the Republic, this was not a person, but a group of representatives from all 7 independent states, the States General. The de facto leader of this government was its advisor, Attorney General Johan van Oldenbarneveld. France and England also waged war against Spain, but both their sovereigns wanted peace. French King Henri IV already had it, and English Queen Elizabeth Tudor was thinking about it. Many of the renowned Spanish military commanders were gone, but a new one had just arrived from Spain, Don Francisco López Hurtado de Mendoza y Mendoza, Almiral de Aragón. The highly experienced commander of the Spanish forces in the Low Countries, Admiral Mendoza, led a massive army of 23,000 foot and 2,500 horse. Count Maurits had about a third of that, 6,000 foot and about 1,700 horse. However, the admiral had brought no cannons. He refused to do sieges. The rebel towns were too well fortified, and Mendoza wouldn't waste precious money trying his hand at that. He wanted to fight the rebel army in the field, but Count Maurits hated field battles and avoided them at all costs. Archduke Albrecht first sent the admiral to Germany, though, to take care of some Protestant issues there. He himself went to Spain to pick up his bride, Isabella, and appointed his cousin, Cardinal Andreas von Österreich, Markgraf von Burgau, as his temporary replacement as Governor-General. Mendoza grabbed the town of Orzau in the Rhineland, but quickly ran into problems with his large army. All the men needed to be fed and paid. He had money for neither. So the admiral introduced a new method to fund his army. He allowed his men to plunder all the local farmers and civilians for food and money, and the surrounding towns had to pay him contributions. But his men not only plundered, but also burned down farms, crops, and farmland, stripping the land bare in no time. Soon the Spanish soldiers, some of whom hadn't eaten in 5 days, started getting restless. Entire companies just walked away, and some eventually defected to Count Maurits's army. The Republic paid better, and on time, and they felt they didn't have to keep their oath to the king anymore. He'd broken his first by not paying them. Several German princes decided to pull together an army to drive the Spanish out and sent Mendoza a message asking him to control his men. But the admiral responded, "I am an enemy of the Lutherans and was sent to these lands by God to exterminate the heresy and recklessness which has remained unpunished for so long." The princes also asked Count Maurits to help them, but the Stadtholder was outnumbered 3-1 and could only harass the royal troops a little. In October, Mendoza captured Bürik and then arrived at Rheinberg. These guys were probably sick and tired by now of constantly being taken and retaken by the 2 warring parties. The citizens were ready to surrender, but garrison commander Lucas Hedding swore he'd hold Rheinberg for Count Maurits. The city could have held, but on October 14th, the town was rocked by a massive explosion. The tower, where the gunpowder was kept, had caught fire and exploded. The shock wave was so severe that numerous houses collapsed. Even the half-moon bastion outside the city was badly damaged. Now Rheinberg was out of gunpowder, had lost many soldiers, and Commander Hedding lay buried under the rubble. The town surrendered the next day. One side effect of the explosion, however, was that the plague was gone. So, win? Mendoza bought Wesel for 120,000 ducats, took Rees on October 30th, then Xanten and Emmerich. Everyone had to convert from Protestantism to Roman Catholicism. Then the admiral turned his attention to the Netherlands. On November 5, 1598, Admiral Mendoza invaded the Republic and appeared before Doetinchem. 4 days later, the town surrendered, and the Spanish entered the city. When Count Maurits inspected the Doetinchem surroundings afterward, he found many ill and dying royal soldiers in the field. He asked the Spanish garrison commander Inigo de Ortoya to bring them into the town and take care of them. Ortoya praised Maurits' humanity, but was like, "Not my problem." Oh, wow. The Count was visibly upset about this careless attitude toward soldiers, and he worried about where the Spanish would go next. Well, back to Germany. For winter quarters, Cardinal Andreas had run out of money. German towns once more had to play host to Mendoza and his merry men. The cities were once again sacked and burned, men were hanged, buried alive, and thrown from towers for sport, and thousands of women in all layers of society were brutally outraged. The people started calling Mendoza the Beast and the Terror of Christendom. The Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II wrote a letter to tell Mendoza off. The admiral laughed away anything he said. But when Mendoza saw that the German princes started gathering a large army, he quickly backed down. He didn't want to get the King of Spain involved in another war. So he sent envoys to a council meeting in Köln to apologize for his men's behavior. But they should stop listening to the lies that the rebels were telling them about the Spanish. We're the good guys here. In case they'd forgotten, the Duke of Parma had left the German towns alone under one condition: that they capture the Schenkenschans. But they hadn't, and now look what happened. The rebels invaded, occupied the neutral zone, and plundered it. Mendoza had liberated the German Empire from these heretics, and unlike these rebels, the Spanish weren't gonna keep the captured towns. Sure, his men had been plundering as well, and that was sad, but they'd been starving, and it was a small price to pay for the well-being of all of Christendom. However, the admiral promised, hand on heart, that they would leave Germany before the end of April next year. Meanwhile, the campaign of the German princes to defeat the Spanish quickly fell apart. Their soldiers were undisciplined, and neither party wanted the other to be the commander-in-chief. Count Philipp von Hohenlohe and Count Georg Eberhard von Solms had joined the imperial army for this campaign, but they turned out to be better commanders following orders than commanders giving orders, and returned to the state service a little later. On his way to Spain, Archduke Albrecht took a detour to visit his brother Emperor Rudolf in Praga, and then picked up the 15-year-old Margaretha von Österreich in Greiz. She was King Felipe III's fiancée and his first cousin once removed. Albrecht brought her to Spain for a double wedding ceremony. He was also going to marry Isabella properly this time. Count Philips Willem of Nassau, Count Maurits' eldest half-brother, joined the Archduke on his journey. The Count half feared that he would be imprisoned again, but the king just wanted him to attend his wedding. Philips Willem had stopped by the Princedom of Orange on the way over, but no one there took him seriously. Its governor was a Protestant and a Count Maurits appointee. In fact, the stadtholder had been plotting to snatch the crown away from his half-brother, but King Felipe got King Henri of France to intervene. Henri restored Philips Willem's rights to Orange under one condition. He had to marry the French king's first cousin, Eleanor de Bourbon-Condé. The kid was 11, so the 44-year-old had to wait a few years before he could marry her. But Philips Willem was officially crowned the Prince of Orange. For nearly a century, by the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Portuguese held exclusive rights to the spice trade in Asia. All their trade goods arrived in Lisbon, where Dutch merchants picked them up and sold them all over Europe at a huge profit. Although bulk goods like wood and wheat from the Baltic were the Dutch main trade income, it still is to this day. When King Felipe II seized the throne of Portugal in 81, he banned all rebel merchants from Portuguese harbors. The king was worried that these traders might give his new subjects some ideas to revolt against him. So, what did the Dutch do? Did they sit back and say, well, that's no more spices for us? Of course not. They were gonna cut out the middleman and get those spices themselves. But the way to the east was long, hazardous, and unknown. The Portuguese trade routes were kept in highly guarded secret logbooks. They had to find a new way, preferably one where they wouldn't run into Spanish and Portuguese ships underway. One option to the east was the Northern Passage. 3 expeditions went out, but none were successful. The third expedition, led by Jacob van Heemskerk and Jan Rijp and piloted by Willem Barentzoon, got stranded in the ice, and their survival story was incredible. It's now a Dutch movie, Nova Zembla. Meanwhile, Jan Huygen van Linschoten had drawn maps on one of his trips to India, and Cornelis de Houtman had settled in Lisbon as a spy to steal the trade route secrets. He got caught and was thrown in prison, but Amsterdam merchants paid his ransom and he returned home with all the intel. Houtman was given 4 ships, broke through the Portuguese blockades, and more or less successfully took the first rebel ships to Java. But he did not receive a warm welcome there. The Portuguese had been telling everyone in the Indies that the Dutch were a vile folk who only wanted to steal from them. The trip was considered hopeful, and during the following expeditions, Amsterdam merchants won the trust of the locals by protecting them from the Portuguese, who had not treated them well. But the Dutch rebels couldn't explain to Pangeran Ratu, the ruler of Banten, why they didn't have a king, and no one took him seriously. So the merchants told him that Count Maurits was the Emperor of Holland. That worked like a charm, and the merchants returned home with the goods and gifts from the King of Banten for Emperor Maurits. King Felipe soon realized that the ban of the rebel trade only worked against him and his merchants, so he stopped enforcing the ban. But in January 1599, the young and still inexperienced King Felipe III followed the advice of his counselors and reinstated his father's edict. The Dutch rebels were truly banned from trading in the entire Spanish-Portuguese realm, so they could no longer fund the war. He shouldn't have done that. He really shouldn't have done that. Now everyone and their rebel mother headed out to Asia, and a ton of shipping companies got involved in the spice trade. However, this created competition, lowered the prices, and suppressed profit margins, which messed up the collection of state taxes needed to fund the war. And while out in the east, the Holland and Zeeland merchants started fighting among themselves instead of fighting the Spanish and the Portuguese like they were supposed to. It was a race to the bottom, and that had to stop. Attorney General Johan of Oldenbarneveld got an idea: bring all rivaling shipping companies together under one banner and take over the world. So the idea for the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch United East India Company, was born. But it would be a few more years before it was all figured out. The VOC ended up being the most wealthy company in the world ever. All because the Felipes thought they were being clever by blocking the rebel merchants from their ports. And well, over time, the Dutch turned out to be every bit as vile as the Portuguese had said they were. In April 1599, Admiral Mendoza kept his promise to the Germans and invaded the rebel Netherlands and take control of the Rhine and Waal rivers and force Holland into submission. Count Maurits's troops were spread out all over the Netherlands and in Germany, and he was left with about 4,000 men to fight off 12,000 Spanish. At the Captain General's request, the government had hired 4,000 Frenchmen, 2,000 Germans, 1,000 Swiss, and another 9 squadrons of horse, but they hadn't arrived yet. The Admiral and Cardinal Andreas besieged the highly strategically located Schenkenschans, or the Key to the Islands, as Andreas called it, the islands being Holland and Zeeland. The Spanish drove the rebel ships away, and Mendoza placed batteries on both sides of the river and unleashed the cannons on the fort. The commander of the English forces in the Low Countries, Sir Francis Vere, was in England at the time, but 800 of his men inside the fort returned fire furiously. Then, on May 1st, in the middle of the night, Royal Army Colonel Claude La Barlotte, Lord of Topanga, transported 5,000 men up the Maas River. He disembarked near Hedel and grabbed its fort. Mendoza suddenly broke off the siege of the Schenkenschans and headed for the Bommelerwaard, where he took the Crèvecoeur fort by surprise 6 days later. Mendoza could have grabbed the weaker and pro-Spanish cities in the area and made a killing, but he didn't. He headed for Zaltbommel instead. Maurits moved fast. That town couldn't withstand a siege. Zaltbommel had always been of great strategic importance, but the new fortifications weren't finished yet. Count Maurits headed over with 3,000 foot and 700 horse to supply the town and encourage the citizens. Everyone pulled together to finish the bastions. Then the stadtholder sailed the rest of his army and the artillery down the rivers. The newly hired troops and Count Ludwig Günther and his men had arrived, and now the stadtholder had about 10,000 foot and 3,000 horse. Though he was more or less matched with the Spanish now, the Count refused to fight them unless they started it. In case you forgot, Maurits hated field battles. At Zaltbommel, La Barlotte placed the cannons and started digging the trenches toward the city, but work progressed slowly. He was constantly attacked by the rebel forces on the outside and sorties from the town on the inside. The cost of the delays were enormous. Since the siege was a snooze fest, Mendoza attacked Tiel, but there he ran into Count Hans Casimir and got nowhere. On June 13, 1599, Count Maurits opened fire on the Spanish camp with such a fury that Mendoza was forced to break off the Zaltbommel siege. The admiral, angry and disappointed, swore he'd be back. Mendoza now started construction of a formidable fort west of Herveden. He named it San Andres after the substitute governor-general Cardinal Andreas. Ain't that sweet? From across the river, Count Maurits kept blasting his cannons at the fort, slowing construction down a lot. These delays also cost the admiral a fortune. After losing many men during various rebel attacks and barely being able to make a dent in the Republic's defenses, Mendoza gave up. He left a garrison of 2,000 in the unfinished San Andres fort and retreated to Brabant. The ever-eager La Barlotte, however, planned to take Woudrichem with 1,500 men. He dressed some of them as farmers, carrying concealed pistols and long knives. But the watchman noticed the suspicious behavior of La Barlotte's men at the city gates and sounded the alarm. When armed citizens showed up to defend the city, La Barlotte had to leave. Count Maurits quickly recaptured all the places the admiral had seized, and a month later, Count Willem Lodewijk retook Doetinchem after a 2-day siege. So, for 2 years, Mendoza had sustained a large army, but had achieved next to nothing. The Nassaus received much international praise for their defensive strategies. Queen Elizabeth was so impressed with Maurits' skills that she called him the first captain of all Christendom. In September, Albrecht returned to Brussels with Isabella and Prince Philips Willem of Orange. The city threw massive and excessive welcoming parades, parties, and banquets. Those in the southern Netherlands who had remained loyal to their lord, the King of Spain, believed a new day had dawned. The Archduke and Archduchess would bring peace and prosperity at long last. Albrecht now invited Queen Elizabeth to start some informal negotiations for peace. Elizabeth told the Republic not to worry. She was still their friend and would do everything to protect them from French or Austrian rule. Still, the Queen continued the negotiations, and it made the rebel Dutch very uncomfortable. In October, Philips Willem was accepted in the highly prestigious Spanish Order of the Golden Fleece. He was also made a member of the Council of State of the Spanish Netherlands. Those in the Republic were bummed. They had hoped to turn Willem of Orange's firstborn into a rebel yet, but the Prince of Orange remained very much a Roman Catholic and loyal to the King of Spain. Meanwhile, Count Frederik Hendrik celebrated his Sweet 16 in January 1600. Birthday gift-giving wouldn't become a thing until about 20 years later, but Frederik Hendrik did receive a beautiful inlaid dagger from his godfather and namesake, King Henri of France. The young man had spent some time at Henri's court with his mother, Louise de Coligny. Here, F. Henri had learned all about court manners and etiquette. He could probably teach Count Maurits a thing or two, because that man ignored pretty much all protocols that he, as a great noble, had to honor. The stadtholder shocked people when he talked to his stable master with his hat in hand. Can you believe it? To talk to your lessers with a bared head? Oh my word! The States General made Frederik Hendrik a member of the Council of State to learn all about how the country was governed. Mooi Heintje, as he was called because he was pretty, turned out to be quite the diplomat, like his father, and unlike his brother, who didn't have a diplomatic bone in his body. Speaking of bone, somewhere around this time, the 32-year-old Maurits met the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. That's it. That's all he ever said about her. The stadtholder was a man of few words, but he was clearly smitten with Margarethe van Mechelen. The 19-year-old was a lady-in-waiting for the Count's stepmother, Louise, and his distant cousin from the Roman Catholic branch of the family. Margarethe didn't have a high rank, she was a lesser noble, and she was a Roman Catholic. Maurits wasn't planning on marrying her. Soon the two started hanging out more and more and more. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, know what I mean? In January 1600, it started to freeze long and hard in northern Europe. The Republic's natural defenses of rivers and streams were frozen shut, and the country once again lay wide open for a Spanish invasion. Admiral Mendoza couldn't make a move because new mutinies had broken out, and he had to stay put to prevent an all-out revolt. But Count Maurits used the frozen rivers to transport cannons to Wachtendonk. If he captured that place, he'd be able to attack cities like Roermond, Venlo, Gelder, and control more of the Maas River upstream. Only 80 men defended Wachtendonk because the rest was out plundering, and Count Ludwig Gunther took the place with little effort. The loot was huge. You see, the locals had stored their valuables in that castle to protect it from the looters. Oops. Ludwig Gunther and his men raced back to the Tielerwaard because there were rumors that La Barlotte planned to use the frozen rivers to invade Holland from there. Maurits immediately sent troops to Gorinchem and ordered those in Dordrecht, Papendrecht and Puttershoek to break the ice of the rivers. Though La Barlotte really wanted to make a move, he couldn't. His men and those in Fort Saint-Andrés and Crèvecoeur mutinied. Everyone demanded their salaries. The soldiers kicked out their commanders, picked an Aletto, a mutiny commander, and occupied several towns like Hamont, Weert, and Diest. Soon there were 4,000 mutineers, about 12% of the Spanish forces in the Low Countries. In March, Count Maurits took advantage of the Archduke's troubles. He wrote to those in Fort Saint-Andrés that he felt their pain and that as a supporter of all soldiers, enemy or not, he wanted nothing more than to give them justice. And they could trust him. Hadn't he helped their friends at Sichem? The mutineers didn't respond. Then the stadtholder went grandstanding at Fort Crèvecoeur. After a relief army of 500 led by Marquis de Varambon was beaten back with a loss of 250 men, the Crèvecoeur garrison made terms and surrendered. Some of them continued the mutiny at Saint-Andrés, others stopped, and others still ripped up their banners and joined the Count's army. The stadtholder had promised them 2 months' pay in advance, and they received it. 2 days later, Maurits appeared before Fort Saint-Andrés. He didn't think there'd be much resistance here either, but he was wrong. The place was well fortified and defended by 2,000 soldiers. The Count set up the cannons, but refused to dig trenches toward the walls just yet. He wanted to convince these men to also switch sides. Join me and get paid. But every trumpeter and drummer boy he sent over there with a summons to surrender was ignored. The stadtholder grabbed various forts in the area, flooded the land, and started shooting at the walls. Don Luis de Velasco y Velasco Marqués de Belvedere, Conde de Salazar, was coming to the rescue, but discovered the state's troops were too well dug in. A month into the siege, Oldenbarneveld showed up to tell Maurits to start digging the trenches to the walls already. The Count began the dig that night. 3 days later, Maurits threatened the mutineers that he'd have the fort within 24 hours. Surrender now, or all deals are off the table. Finally, the men agreed to talk. They demanded the states pay for their surrender, a whopping 500,000 guilders. Count Maurits let them sweat a little longer and calculated the projected cost of the siege and the loss of lives. The Captain General ended up offering 125,000 guilders exclusively to those who were prepared to join the state's army. 1,200 of the 2,000 Walloons did, and Fort Saint-Andrés was now in state's hands. And the cannons, provisions, and other loot they captured exceeded the value of the 125,000 guilder ransom. The 1,200 defectors became 11 companies for the rebel army and called themselves the New Beggars. Archduke Albrecht declared these soldiers traitors and banished them. War was expensive. The Spanish may have been broke, but the Dutch rebels weren't doing much better. They started to feel the effects of the trade restrictions. And then there were the pirates' nests in Duinkerke and Newport. These Spanish pirates attacked and destroyed any vessel to disrupt trade, from the warships that accompanied the rebel merchant fleets to the defenseless fishermen. They gave no quarter. After the raiders plundered the vessels, they set the ships adrift with the sailors nailed to the deck or chained to the rigging. And if they decided to keep the ships, they simply chucked the entire crew overboard. It cost the States General 1 million guilders a year to send warships to escort the rebel merchant fleets. Still, a lot of crews, cargo, and ships were lost to pirates each year. To make matters worse, in September 99, the 27-year-old Don Federico Spinola, a wealthy Genoese and man of adventure, had arrived in Sluis. Though he had been on his way to Dunkirk, he'd gotten lost. But Spinola decided to make his base there. He commanded 6 galley ships on behalf of the Spanish realm and had negotiated with the King of Spain that since he funded the vessels, Spinola could keep all the loot for himself. These rowing ships were used for naval warfare in the Mediterranean, but had rarely been seen in the North Sea. They were rowed by galley slaves who were mostly prisoners of war. They didn't rely on the wind and were also perfect for the shallow waters and sandbanks of Zeeland. It was virtually impossible to see them coming because no sails, and the English and Dutch called them the Invisible Armada. But once the rebels recovered from their shock and awe, they quickly built their own versions of galley ships, so-called black galleys, and they treated any captured pirates as harshly, if not more so, than they had treated them. The brutal sea beggars were back in action. When Count Maurits asked Albrecht to treat his captured sailors with more kindness, the Archduke was like, "You're one to talk." His men were fighting a war on the king's behalf, but the rebels refused to treat captured or even surrendered crews like prisoners of war. They were executed instead. The rebels even strung up dead people next to the living they were about to hang. He must be new here. Now the States started to dream of the money they'd save if they got their hands on Dunkirk, Newport and Sluis. They'd no longer have to pay for the blockades, the military convoys, and the loss of good ships and people. On top of that, they'd have free access to trade and fishing. This would increase the merchants' income and bring in more taxes to fill up the war chest. And better still, these Flemish cities and villages in the area would also become part of the Republic and pay contributions to that war chest. Win, win, win. Of course, there were also political motives. First, the States General wanted to make the Zeelanders, who wanted to protect their borders, happy. Second, Ostende, the only place in Flanders still in rebel hands, was super isolated. With the other towns under the Republic's rule, its defenses would be vastly improved. If the operation was successful, and the States General didn't doubt this at all, there were even better outcomes down the line. The Spanish Netherlands would lose all access to the sea and be financially ruined. This in turn would force Archduke Albrecht to negotiate for peace. And if they played their cards right, they could even annex the whole of Flanders to the Republic. And France would be oh so happy with their successes that they would join the war again. And England would stop the peace negotiations it was conducting with Spain. Let's do this! In March 1600, the States held a couple of meetings in Zeeland and drafted a plan to besiege the pirate cities and drive the Spanish out. This was the plan. They'd sail the rebel army to Ostend and disembark there. That would take a day. From there, they would march 28 miles on Dunkirk via Newport. That would take 3 days. Newport would fall right away and Dunkirk maybe after 8 days. The mission would be done and dusted in 3.5 weeks tops. They would give the army food and supplies for 24 days. This could easily work because most of the royal forces were 200 miles away, a week's worth of marching. And these guys wouldn't even hear about the top secret mission until a week after the rebels started. All this meant that the States had about a month before any Spanish would even show up. By that time, everyone would be back home again, having gained the entire Flemish coastline in the process. A military campaign to Dunkirk it was. But there was one problem. They hadn't included Count Maurits, Captain General of the States Armies and Admiral of the States Navies, Stadholder of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel in these meetings. And they hadn't bothered to consult other generals or any other military experts either. They'd probably done that on purpose, because Count Maurits thought the entire plan sucked. The commander-in-chief of the English contingent in the States Army, Sir Francis Vere, thought the plan sucked more. And General Willem Lodewijk, Stadholder of Friesland, Groningen and Drenthe, thought the plan sucked most. It was suicide. The campaign could wipe out the entire States Army, which meant the end of the war and subsequent utter annihilation of the Republic. And any victory would be short-lived. First off, a 24-day campaign? Where did they get the unholy idea that only Sluis was fortified and these other cities were easy pickings? And speaking of that city, attacking the harbor towns further down south with Sluis still in Spanish hands was completely insane. They should take that city first. And with Sluis in rebel hands, it would be much easier to protect that Zeeland border. Nope, the States General wanted Dunkirk. Okay, so if the States wanted any chance of success, the campaign had to be a surprise attack. This was possible by sea, but by no means easy. The weather and tide needed to be just right for it to work. A campaign over land was even more difficult. They'd have to move through hostile territory, and then it would no longer be a surprise attack. All the towns they wanted to conquer would be ready for them long before they got there. The States Army would be on Spanish home turf, whose troops could escape to many places. The States only had one escape route: Ostend. All Albrecht had to do was to block the road to Ostend, and they'd be trapped out there and starve. And yeah, those little mutinies weren't gonna prevent Albrecht from assembling the Avengers. And those Spanish troops that would take a month to get to them? You're kidding, right? Even if they were on the other side of the country, they'd be on him in days, not weeks. And Belasco may only have 5,000 foot and 1,000 horse now, but he could easily pick up 4,000 or 5,000 more men along the way and match the state's army strength in no time. And say, if by some miracle they did win and weren't stopped or trapped, how would the Republic hold on to Dunkirk, Newport and Veurne, which FYI also had to be seized along the way, so deep into Spanish Netherlands territory? It would take massive garrisons, and they would draw constant fire. And another thing, why did the States General think that France would re-enter the war after this campaign? The French envoys had told Count Maurits that Dunkirk was too small a prize for the King of France to give up his peace. Of course, Dunkirk could be given to the English, who'd been eyeing it for a while, and that might force a renegotiation of the damned war loan that was hanging around the state's neck, dragging down the economy. But Elizabeth cancelling peace negotiations over a single harbor town across the channel? Bitch, please. So no. Go to Sluis, go to Brabant, or stabilize the Rhine front, by all means. Anything but this for Pete's sake. It should have given the politicians pause that every single highly experienced military commander opposed the very concept of the plan. It didn't. Johan of Oldenbarneveld had made up his mind. On June 3rd, 1600, Count Maurits came before the States General to warn them of the utter stupidity and recklessness of the proposed campaign. But the Stadtholder wasn't the most strong-willed man on the block, and though he was a top general, he had no patience for these endless discussions and diplomatic jibber-jabber. For some reason, he let the States General Oldenbarneveld talk him into the plan, albeit under protest. On that day, June 3rd, 1600, the States General signed off on a campaign to Dunkirk. The preparations for the secret mission to the Flemish coast progressed at lightning speed. The money that Count Maurits had been begging for years suddenly became available. His army was now so large he could afford to split it up to defend the Republic while he was away. Maurits' cousin and partner in war, Count Willem Lodewijk, would stay in Friesland, but he sent some of his Frisian companies along. General Philip von Hohenlohe was sent to Nijmegen with 1,500 foot and 500 horse. To his shock and dismay, Hohenlohe had recently discovered that Count Maurits never considered him to be his lieutenant general. No matter how much he ranted and raved at the States General, these appointments were made by the Stadtholder, and Stadtholder Maurits refused to appoint him. Meanwhile, Archduke Albrecht started hearing rumors about some massive campaign, but had no idea where it would go. He was most worried about the area around the Rhine and sent Belasco there to shore it up. The state's army consisted of 128 companies foot, 25 squadrons horse, 16 whole cannons, 14 half cannons, 7 field guns, and over 250 wagons for ammo, weapons, tools, and food for everyone. In total, 17,000 men and 3,050 horses were going on this little field trip into Flanders. There were Frisians, Hollanders, Zeelanders, Utrechters, Walloons, Germans, English, French, Swiss, and Scots. In June, the fleet was assembled in Dordrecht. Nearly 1,000 ships were moored there. It got so crowded that there was hardly any shore length left. On June 17th, Count Maurits arrived with a section of the infantry and other commanders. He brought along his half-brother Frederik Hendrik and his cousin, the Count of Coligny, grandchild to the late Admiral of France, but also the young Duke Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp, Prince von Anhalt, Duke of Alsace, the Prince of Hainaut, and other young great nobles to teach them all about the art of sieges. As per usual, Council of State and States General representatives were also there. They had to pay the wages, advise the generals, and report back to the States General. But this time, members of the Council of State and the States General were also coming along. Even Oldenbarneveld showed up. Count Maurits had demanded it, most likely because he wasn't going to take the blame if this thing went south. Oldenbarneveld, on the other hand, wanted to make sure that Maurits stuck to the plan and didn't deviate as he always did when it was more convenient to him. There was another reason these long skirts came along. The politicians wanted to ask for contributions from the Flemish cities and villages, but their message was one of positivity. We are your liberators! On June 19th, Count Maurits arrived with the first ships at Fort Rammekens. The fleet had grown to 1,300 ships and was accompanied by 16 warships and 100 English vessels. The Captain General stayed on board to prevent anyone else from going ashore. But while there, they changed plans. They would go straight to Newport instead of stopping by Ostend first. There were 2 lines of Spanish forts between Ostend and Newport, and it would take too much time to swipe those up on the go. They planned to head out the next day, June 20th, but the wind blew on land, not out to sea. Count Maurits asked the States General if he could go besiege Sluis instead. They said no. The weather was even worse the day after that. The stadtholder once more suggested attacking Sluis. The States General said no, but the 3,000 plus horses couldn't stay on board any longer without fresh water. They would die. So they changed plans. Again. And an already reckless campaign became even more reckless. They would now land in the border town of Philippine. This was way, way, way further north than Newport or even Ostend. Instead of arriving at Newport on the 24th as scheduled, they'd get there no sooner than the 29th. That is to say, if they didn't encounter any problems underway. And just like that, Count Maurits gave the Spanish 5 extra days to get their troops together. The support fleet with the supplies would continue on to Ostend, where they would join the army as they arrived. Now 17,000 men needed extra food for the 5-day march, and they needed to get these supplies from the area. The States General promised they would provide. Why didn't the always so careful and organized Maurits have a plan B for bad weather? Had he counted on the States General to realize their blunder mid-mission, force their hand in the field and agree with him to take Sluis instead? If that was his big plan, it hadn't worked. Archduke Albrecht had found out about the embarkation at Dordrecht on the 20th, but had no idea where the fleet was headed yet. Belasco heard about it that same day and raced to Maastricht. On June 21, 1600, at 4 p.m., Count Maurits and the fleet dropped anchor at Biervliet. An hour later, Count Ernst Casimir of Nassau, who had been sent ahead, disembarked at Philippine with orders to take the Spanish fort. FYI, Philippine was named after the Burgundian Philippe le Beau, King Philippe III's great-grandfather. The Spanish holding the fort saw the rebels coming and quickly set fire to some houses nearby. When Ernst Casimir sent a drummer boy to the fort demanding surrender, the Spanish refused to listen to the terms. They opened fire on the state's troops instead. The Count instantly returned fire, ordered a storm, and killed the sergeant and 5 Spanish soldiers. The remaining 27 men negotiated a surrender and left the fort with only their luggage. Count Maurits arrived in Philippine the next day with the rest of the fleet and ordered everyone to disembark. The disembarkation took 5 hours. They had to wait for low tide, and it was muddy. They struggled to rein in the horses before the carts, the wagons, and the cannons. Maurits appointed 5 principal commanders to lead the army to Newport. Count Ernst Casimir, Count Georg Eberhard von Solms, and Sir Francis Vere would alternate between vanguard, battalion, and rearguard. Count Ludwig Günther was in charge of the cavalry. The artillery and the army train were commanded by wagon master John Langley. June 23rd. It was a rainy day. At the break of dawn, Ernst Casimir's vanguard found the town of Assenede abandoned by the Spanish. Its 50 defenders had taken cover in the Lord of Wakenen's fortified manor. The men surrendered at the sight of 2 cannons being put in place, and they were allowed to leave with their sidearm. The rest of the army soon joined Ernst Casimir and stayed the night at Assenede, except for Marcellus Bucks and his men, who stayed behind in Philippine to guard the artillery, which was still being offloaded. The politicians arrived last. Their wagons hadn't been brought over yet, and the men had to ride on top of the munitions wagons. Around noon, Ludwig Günther sent 200 horse on a raid to Ghent and Sos van Ghent. The men encountered the Spanish cavalry in both towns. Those in Ghent sword-heat forcefully, and because the rebels had no infantry with them, they fell back. Still, they returned in the evening with many horses and cows. Now the troops had fresh horses and a lot of hamburgers for their barbecue. Meanwhile, Belasco arrived in Maastricht. The whole army train was 10 miles long when they entered enemy territory, and if they thought they were welcome, they were dead wrong. Count Maurits had expressly ordered his soldiers to treat the peasants gently and justly, but they found no peasants nor villagers to speak of. Many locals had fled into the woods, and those left behind didn't like this foreign army one bit. The States General had not done their research. They had not sent in spies to gauge the atmosphere in these here parts. It was hostile, very hostile. The Flemish didn't think these rebels were their liberators, they were an occupying force. Some of them lay hidden in the bushes and mercilessly killed the stragglers of the rebel army. They were genuinely sick and tired of the war, but they considered the whole idea of belonging to the Calvinist Republic appalling. They were Roman Catholic and wanted to stay that way. June 24th. It was a nice day. Marcellus Bucks arrived with the remainder of the artillery and the army moved west. It was Solmes's turn to take point. Veer had the Battalia and Ernst Casimir brought up the rear. They passed through Bassevelde, Kaprijke, and the vanguard reached Eeklo at 1 p.m., which they plundered for horses and carts. The rearguard arrived much later. The road was in bad condition and long, and they'd ended up on the road to Ghent instead of Eeklo. The States Army had no maps and used local guides to show them the way, but these men were not aware of an army's needs and they started down so-called robber roads that were not fit for the heavy cannons and the many carts. Some cannons even slipped off the road a few times. Eventually, the States Army had to turn around on a very narrow path. Imagine the absolute chaos. I mean, one half cannon was pulled by 23 horses. If the Spanish had been in the neighborhood, they could have made a killing on the Impedimenta. As the States Army approached Bruges, the city quickly allowed the Spanish troops to come in. All this time, they'd been successfully kept outside where they could do no harm to the citizens. Nice going, guys. Count Maurits received word from Hohenlohe that Belasco was on the move and headed for the Maas. Well, so much for the surprise. With Belasco gone, though, Hohenlohe was going to be able to supply Wachtendonk. No one seemed too worried about Belasco coming. It's not like Albrecht was going anywhere, right? Wrong. Archduke Albrecht saw his chance. Count Maurits on an expedition meant an open field battle, much destruction, much glory. The Archduke moved fast. He swallowed his pride, offered the mutineers their pay, and appealed to their faith. They weren't gonna let these heretics invade their land, were they? Fight to the death! 800 foot and 600 horse from Diest signed up under 3 conditions. They would get paid, pick their own commanders, and be first in line to do battle and thus the first to claim victory and plunder. Albrecht agreed. Nearly all other mutineer companies also joined up under the same conditions. Albrecht ordered Belasco, who was still in Maastricht on the other side of the Netherlands, to arrive in Ghent on June 29th. It was a 125-mile trek, and he had 5 days to get there. Everyone was sent to Ghent to join the various garrisons already underway. June 25th. The weather was beautiful. The rebels discovered several of their men hanging from the trees. They'd been captured by local farmers who had strung them up. The vanguard also found a soldier's wife's horribly mutilated body. These men had probably been plunderers, but the state's representatives didn't care. They ordered all homes of Eeklo to be burned down to avenge their soldiers, and then the army burnt every house underway. Because war. The States Army left very early, and now it was Francis Veer's turn to take point. He was directly followed by the Impedimenta. After all the chaos the previous day, they realized how vulnerable the rear was. The States Army passed by Maldegem and made camp at the castle of Male, just a few miles outside Bruges. They had plenty of supplies, but the water turned brackish, and beer was running out. And when you have an army of 17,000 men, you don't want to run out of beer. 2 hours before dawn, Count Maurits sent Ludwig Gunther and his men on a raid to Bruges. Those from Bruges unleashed the cannons on them. Then they sent their cavalry, but they sword-hit from the wrong side of the city. Ludwig Gunther returned an hour later with 40 prisoners, 150 horses, and 1,200 cows. That's a lot of hamburgers. The prisoners were mostly women, young men, and poor people, but they had also captured a soldier. He told the counts that 580 men had left Forts Oudenburg and Bredene because they had heard that the States Army had arrived at Sas van Gent. They set out for Ghent, but when they found out that the rebels were moving on Bruges, they went there instead. The men had set up camp southeast of the town. Then cannon blasts rang out from the sea. What the frack? 40 rebel merchant ships wanted to beat the competition to Ostend, and they had left Flushing against orders. One warship commanded by Captain Bankert had joined them, but the wind had dropped, and they were dead in the water at Blankenberge. 2 of Spinola's galleys rowed out from Sluis to attack them. They captured 20 vessels and killed their crews. Some were taken prisoner to become galley slaves in turn. Some owners burned their ships and got aboard the warship to help defend it, but the war vessel's slackened sails made it an easy target. It was shot at and shot through many times, but not boarded. The sailors finally recovered to fight back, but most of them were wounded, and 23 of the 50 crew had died, including Captain Bankert. But now they returned fire furiously. The galleys sustained so much damage with so many killed that Spinola backed off. Fortunately, this merchant fleet had been small, and only half of it had been destroyed or captured, but they were the army supply line. Without it, everyone would starve. Count Maurits was mad that the States Admiral Johan van Duivenvoorde hadn't stopped these rogue ships. That night, several States cavalry squadrons headed for Bruges and raided the camp of the Spanish soldiers from Forts Oudenburg and Bredene. They brought home 5 banners. First win. June 26th. The weather was beautiful. The States Army was underway again. Ernst Casimir took point with Ludwig Günther, the artillery and the impedimenta. Solms had the battalia, while Wier brought up the rearguard. The Spanish were convinced Count Maurits went straight to Bruges to get them to join the rebellion. No, the stadtholder just didn't know how else to go. They had to walk right past Bruges city walls on the south side. This was a massive blunder. It was a 2.5-mile long track all the way to the Ghentpoort, and it took the train 4 hours to pass the city, across the Minnewater Bridge, past Sint Andries, onto Oudenburg. And even if they had held out hope, the Bruges citizens didn't want to join them. They shot at the States Army from the walls, but other than one of Maurits's mules, no one was hurt. They lucked out that there weren't enough Spanish troops in the city yet. But these guys did take extensive notes on who and what they saw go by and passed it on to Albrecht. Great going, guys. Count Maurits had hoped to arrive in Oudenburg later that day, but they didn't. The battalia was led down the wrong road and marched in the direction toward Ghent for 2.5 miles. It wasn't until they got to Loppen before they realized where they were. Fortunately, they were getting really good at turning around on narrow roads, and they marched almost all the way back to Bruges. And then they went the wrong way again, and they were on the road to Dixmude. But they hung a right and ended up on the correct road at last. They now had a 5-hour delay, and the various army sections were separated by miles. The cavalry of the vanguard had stood still for hours waiting for everyone to catch up with them. Count Maurits didn't even know there was a problem. He and Ludwig Günther's cavalry had stayed near Bruges to make sure the artillery got across safely. The main army passed Varsenare and arrived at Jobbeke. From the sea, the cannon blast rang out again. These were the remaining state supply ships escorted by 16 warships. The wind had suddenly dropped right before Ostend, and they were dead in the water. 4 of Spinola's galleys were right back at it. But the warships sailed between the fleet and the shore and defended the merchants. When the wind came back, 4 states' warships bore down on a single galley, while the others were blasted out of the water. Only 2 merchant ships were captured, while the rest made port. Back home, Hohenlohe had arrived at Wachtendonk at night with 1,000 foot, 500 horse, 6 cannons, ammo, and supplies. He was preparing his return to Nijmegen. Meanwhile, Belasco's men had all left Maastricht. All the Spanish troops east of Brussels were on the move, including the mutineers from Diest, and everyone was converging on Ghent in record time. And Maurits knew nothing. June 27th, the weather was beautiful. The States Army headed out early and arrived at Oudenburg in the middle of the night. The castle and village were ruined, but the large, well-maintained fort was valuable because it controlled the bridge connecting Ostend with Bruges. It only had a shallow moat, though. The Count of Solms was sent out to take the forts of Bredene, Snaaskerke, Plossendale and some other smaller places. Count Maurits left companies in all the forts to defend the roads behind him. The stadholder then ordered Solms to go on ahead and take Fort Albertus. This place had to be taken to create a safe corridor between Ostend and Newport, their only escape plan. Other forts in the area were ignored because they were surrounded by marshlands and would take too much time to grab. At Oudenburg, the stadholder ordered all the wagons to be offloaded and sent to Ostend for fresh bread and beer. The high and mightinesses of the States General and members of the Council of State headed for Ostend as well. They'd been quite disappointed with their road trip so far. Most towns were ghost towns, and the big cities hadn't responded to their letters to join the Republic or pay the contributions. Most towns had no money, and those who did wouldn't have paid because Albrecht had given them strict orders not to back in March. Again, no research. And yes, that was their title, the High and Mightinesses. I'm not being sarcastic. The Count of Solms had arrived at the Albertus fort. His men hauled 2 half-cannons in place that night. Solms only had these 2 because a third one had broken the bridge and was stuck holding up the other guns. But placing the cannons wasn't easy. The earth around the fort was loose sand, and all the while the men were getting shot at by the 140 men from the Isabella fort. Meanwhile, Albrecht's appeal to the mutineers had been successful. Another 1,000 Spanish foot and 600 horse crossed the Scheldt. Together with the Spanish stationed around Antwerp, they too headed for Ghent. Albrecht now also received the detailed list of Maurits's army from Bruges. Count Maurits didn't really expect anyone to come for 3 more weeks, but they were getting pretty close pretty fast. But Maurits knew nothing. The bulk of the Spanish army had gathered near Ghent in Langerbrugge. The troops consisted of the highly trained Spanish and Italian infantry companies, the tercios, the cavalry, and Irish, Walloon, French, and German soldiers. Albrecht, Isabella, Mendoza, and most Spanish army commanders now left Brussels to meet up with the Spanish army there. Among the many commanders were Claude La Barlotte, Don Alfonso d'Abalos, Don Luis Albano de Villar, and Gaspar Sapena. Mendoza was in charge of the cavalry and the mutineers, who were commanded by their Eleri, Juan Martinez, and Alonso Mayolicino. Pedro Gallego was the admiral's deputy. Maurits's cousin from the Roman Catholic branch of the family, Frederik van den Berg, was the deputy general of the infantry. And Belasco, who was still on his way, got command of the artillery. Albrecht spoke to his men the next day. They were in a good mood and he wanted to encourage them. He declared at last, "I will be there myself in person and run the same fortune with you." Then Isabella, looking proud and fierce on her horse, addressed her lions, as she called the Spanish troops. For so long, they had bravely and valiantly fought against the rebels who, despite all her father's efforts for peace, remained disobedient to the crown and even more so to God. They continued in their heresy against the Roman Catholic faith when they didn't even have a prince of their own. She promised the men endless rewards in this world and the next when they were victorious over the infidels. Not if, when. Isabella assured them that they would receive their wages. Money was coming from her brother in Spain and the obedient Flanders. And she promised to sell her belongings down to her jewelry and even her food plate to pay them. It was quite a rousing speech. The lions applauded, fired their guns and shouted, "Viva la Infanta!" With about 10,000 foot and 1,500 horse, they were now headed for Bruges, fast. And Maurits knew nothing. Meanwhile, Count von Solms had added 4 more cannons overnight and started shooting at Fort Albertus early that morning. Rise and shine, sunshine! That afternoon, the fort's captain Michel Méron felt that he had resisted long enough for an honorable surrender. They were allowed to leave with weapons and luggage and a promise not to serve the Flanders army for 6 months. The rebels left 1 company behind to occupy it. With the supply line to Ostend secured, Count Maurits could finally move on Newport, 10 days behind schedule. The Count of Solms was now ordered to march along the beach, cross the IJzer River at Newport, which served as the harbor, and close off the north side of the town. Count Maurits was going to take Fort Nieuwendamme and close off the city from the south. But the army had not yet been fully resupplied, so Maurits delayed departure for 1 more day. To save time, he sent men ahead to fix, strengthen and create the necessary bridges up to Leffinge. The next day, on June 30th, Maurits ordered Colonel Jean Piron to hold Oudenburg with 6 companies and 2 squadrons. He left 5 companies in Bredene and 1 in the Plassendale fort. Piron should have his back in case some random Spanish showed up. He was promised 2 cannons for support. The army set out for Fort Nieuwendamme. Ludwig Gunther took point, but Ernst Casimir had to wait in Oudenburg for the rest of the cannons to arrive from Ostend. The roads to Nieuwendamme were in terrible shape. The area was an absolute labyrinth of narrow paths and dikes in the middle of marshlands. The wagons carrying the heavy cannons sank deep into the mud. They moved past Snaaskerke, where Maurits left a company, through Leffinge until they came to Slijpe, a mile and a half before Fort Nieuwendamme. They had reached 2 rivers that were too wide to cross. The troops could march further upriver, but that meant building even more bridges, and they'd be too far away from Ostend. A direct assault on Nieuwendamme was risky because Maurits thought that fort was more robust than the others in the area. The Count decided to bypass it, so they crossed the Ieperlee River via a small bridge at Leffinge and headed for the dunes, laying down the road and building new bridges as they went. Finally, around midnight, Maurits, Veer and the cavalry arrived in the dunes at Fort Albertus. They were shot at from Fort Isabella, but no one was harmed. Maurits sent another company to Fort Snaaskerke and dispatched drummers to the remaining Spanish forts to ask if they wanted to surrender. They did not. Meanwhile, Solms had arrived at Westende on the beach, but he did not cross the river to land at Newport just yet. Naturally, the Spanish at Westende shot at him. The same day, Archduke Albrecht arrived in Bruges, and Belasco arrived in Ghent. He had force-marched his troops 25 miles in 8 hours for 4 days straight. That's 5k an hour, more than twice the regular army speed. Respect. But Maurits knew nothing. They hadn't really seen anyone since Assenede, but the Archduke had blocked all roads so no locals could bring them any news. And apparently the Count didn't think it was necessary to send out scouts to check for Spanish troops. July 1st. The weather was beautiful. At last, Newport. The main army joined up with Solms's troops still camped out north of the river. The city was a sturdy, well-built and well-fortified little town. It was a seaport, but only at high tide. At low tide, the ships were stranded, but people could now wade across. Count Maurits immediately took possession of the harbor. At low tide, 2/3 of his army took off their shoes, socks and shirts and waded across the western side of the Iser/harbor. They made camp in the dunes west of the city. While the troops were setting up camp, the Newport cavalry sortied, but their attack was deflected. Belasco arrived in Bruges that morning, but he immediately marched on to catch up with Albrecht, who was taking his infantry to Oudenburg. They were all hot on the rebel army's trail, but Maurits knew nothing, because Colonel Piron at Oudenburg hadn't checked the roads to Bruges daily as he had been ordered to, and because he hadn't received his promised guns and ammo yet, he had sent out 100 men to Ostend to get them. He sent another 150 foot and 90 horse to forage Bruges, leaving the fort nigh unprotected. The raiders had set off in the wrong direction, so they never ran into Albrecht and his troops, who arrived at Piron's doorstep minutes later. Hola! The Archduke instantly laid siege on Oudenburg and set up 6 cannons. Piron was left with about 250 men, no guns, no ammo and no moat. When Albrecht told Piron to surrender Oudenburg fort at noon, the colonel had no choice but to negotiate terms. They could keep their wagons and luggage, but had to leave the banners behind and keep the bridge intact. The Spanish mutineers of Crèvecoeur and San Andrés had to stay behind to be punished. Piron knew Snaaskerke wouldn't stand a chance and included its surrender in the deal, which Albrecht then signed himself. A copy of this letter was sent to Snaaskerke with the order to surrender and go to Ostend. Piron and his men headed out. They were robbed, pushed off their horses, and harassed by the mutineer soldiers despite the agreement. Some were even killed. On their way to Ostend, they passed Plassendale and Bredene. Lieutenant Colonel de Bruges at Bredene had heard what had happened from a woman from Oudenburg. He had already sent his company of Spanish defectors on to Ostend to keep them out of Albrecht's hands. But he didn't want to leave yet, not until he saw the enemy. Sometime later, de Bruges saw what he thought were the Spanish and ran. He didn't realize they were Piron's men, bringing up the rear. Albrecht didn't bother capturing these abandoned forts, left his rear guard in Oudenburg and headed straight for Leffinge and Snaaskerke instead. The two companies at Snaaskerke fort obeyed their orders and marched to Ostend. They were attacked by the Italian soldiers under Majolichino. The two captains, most of the officers, and nearly all soldiers were callously murdered in violation of Albrecht's treaty. But the Archduke was like, well, they started shooting at us, I think. So, not honorable, man. Not honorable at all. Maurits still knew nothing. At Newport, Count Maurits was busy preparing the siege. At noon, Count Ernst Casimir arrived with the cannons, bringing up the rear. He and his men set up camp on the beach northeast of the city. They were now separated from the main army by the IJzer. The stadtholder then sent out troops south to raid Veurne for cows, for, hamburgers. The men were shot at, but returned with a lot of cattle. Then the Newport garrison sortied again to pull a small company out of a fortified redoubt in the harbor and burn it to the ground. The state's carabineers rushed over to prevent the rescue and then took the fortification. The retreating garrison now burned down several houses, including a few close to the city. The two cannons left behind in the fort were now used to cover the sutler ships from Ostend coming in, entering on high tide and stranding at low tide. The Archduke had arrived at Leffinge and made camp. At mid-afternoon, the Spanish abandoned Fort Nieuwendamme and told Albrecht the state's army had arrived at Newport. Meanwhile, the States General in Ostend received word that Piron had abandoned the forts and that the Spanish had arrived with a very, very, very large army. The men thought this was a joke. When they heard the other garrisons had fled as well, they still couldn't believe it. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, about a dozen riders arrived to confirm the news. Now these high and mightinesses got worried. Real worried. At 3:30, the message came that the Spanish had killed many states' officers and soldiers from Snaaskerke and that only a few had managed to get away. So, the stadtholder had lost the forts that were supposed to keep the Spanish army busy and slow them down, and his escape route was gone. The state's army was trapped at Newport, and still, Maurits knew nothing. Instead, his troops leisurely but steadily continued to invest the city, and the stadtholder ordered a bridge to be built across the water so his forces wouldn't be so dangerously divided. That evening, the state's army found out that the Spanish soldiers in Fort Nieuwendamme had abandoned the place, and Casimir moved at once to occupy it and left 150 men to guard it. Piron's raiding army had heard about Albrecht's army while they were at Bruges. The foot soldiers wanted to return to Oudenburg, but the cavalry didn't. The men foot marched back to Fort Oudenburg and arrived late in the afternoon. Because they didn't see the Spanish army, they thought the fort hadn't been taken at all. Well, it had, and a good number were killed, while the rest was taken prisoner. Piron's cavalry headed for Ostend but was sent the wrong way by a local guide, Jasper Olvoet. They ended up at the Spanish-held IJsendijke far to the northeast with the royal troops on their heels. The state's warship anchored nearby didn't or couldn't take them on board. They surrendered to the Spanish, but not before drowning their guide in the creek. At 6 o'clock that evening, a very exhausted and terrified survivor of Snaaskerke arrived at Count Ernst Casimir's tent on the beach. He told him Albrecht was here, had taken all the forts and killed many men in violation of the terms of surrender. Ernst Casimir took the poor man by the arm, told him to shut up and pulled him into a boat. The two of them were rowed to Count Maurits's headquarters. The survivor gave the Captain General a detailed account of what had happened, including the terrible massacre of the surrendered troops. The news was both a big surprise and terrifying. How had Archduke Albrecht gotten his troops in line so quickly? There was just no way. This had to be a mistake. But better safe than sorry, Maurits ordered the raiders to be brought back to camp and cancelled all leaves. Next, the Count woke up Veer and brought in the other generals to confer. After much debate, the commanders eventually decided this wasn't Albrecht's army. It had to be Ribas's men, the Spanish commander of a force gathered at Sluis. The guy was just putting on a show to scare them. Well, they weren't scared. Veer disagreed. People dismissed him, and he was like, fine, and went back to bed. A hard day's work was ahead. At midnight, Veer was pulled out of bed again. A messenger of the States General had arrived. He handed over the agreement for the surrender of the forts. There it was, plain as day, Albrecht's signature and seal. The scale of the disaster dawned on Maurits. They were trapped. All night, Count Maurits talked to his commanders about their options. They could escape to France. Though it was a long march, they'd be too far away from home, plus it would be considered a dishonorable retreat. They could embark everyone on those supply ships and sail away. But they'd have to wait for high tide, and the Spanish could be on them by then, and to do this in the line of sight of the royal army was madness. They could attempt a retreat to the Republic, but then they would definitely run into Albrecht and his men, and they'd be on unfamiliar territory. Or they could stay put and fight. But then they'd have to get the entire army across the harbor again to join up with Ernst Casimir's men on the beach, and Maurits hated field battles. Plus, it was now 3 o'clock at night and high tide. The bridge wasn't finished yet, and low tide was 5 hours away. Either way, they should prevent Albrecht from reaching the beach, or at the very least slow him down to buy more time. So they had to destroy the Leffinge Bridge and keep their escape route to Ostend open. Hadn't they destroyed the bridges behind them, as one does on these kinds of campaigns? Apparently not. Count Ernst Casimir was the only one on the right side of the river and ready to move. He headed out at top speed with about 2,000 foot, 500 horse and 2 half cannons. The stadtholder sent an order post-haste to the States General to send a company to Fort Albertus and tell Piron's 400 horse to help Ernst Casimir at Leffinge. For some reason, this letter wasn't delivered until 10 days later. The Captain General feared Albrecht was already on the move, but he wasn't. He too had gotten lost in the labyrinth, and a nighttime trek through the marshlands was too dangerous. The Archduke had left at 5 a.m. for Fort Nieuwendamme, but when he heard that it had fallen in the state's hands, he decided to go to the beach instead. Ernst Casimir was already marching along that very beach to try to stop him, or at the very least, slow him down. At 6 o'clock on Sunday morning on July 2nd, 1600, Count Ernst Casimir was less than 2 miles away from the last bridge to the beach when he saw the Spanish, who were a lot closer to it than he was. The Count sent his cavalry ahead and ordered them to take and hold that bridge, but they were too late. When the horsemen got to Mariakerke, a ruined town close to the bridge, Albrecht's advance of 2,400 foot and 800 horse were already coming across. Ernst Casimir realized that if they had stayed near Newport, they would have been dead. Had he left 30 minutes later, he would have encountered Albrecht on the beach, and they would have been dead. And now, outnumbered 8-1, they were dead, unless the Count retreated to Fort Albertus or Ostend. Then he and his men would be safe, but the main army back at Newport would be slaughtered. Making a stand, no matter how futile, might just give Count Maurits enough time to execute his plan. Ernst Casimir hesitated for only a moment. He had just enough time to position his troops in a single line behind a sea dike on either side of Mariakerke. The Count put his 2 artillery pieces on top of it to block Albrecht's path. The road to the beach was only a few hundred yards wide, with marshlands on either side. And here Ernst Casimir stood, buying time. On his right were the Scots under Colonel William Edmonds. On his left were the Zeelanders under Karel van der Noot and 4 cavalry squadrons under Lamoral van der Noot, the Lord of Vrizoire. Then the Bruges and Piron arrived with their cavalries from Ostend. The States General, on their own initiative, had sent troops to destroy the bridge. They had only been partially successful in motivating the soldiers to head out. Another 70 of them had refused to go beyond the Albertus fort. The Bruges joined the Scots, Piron the Zeelanders. More and more Spanish troops poured over the bridge and got in battle array. Seeing Ernst Casimir standing there so smug and brave, they were convinced he was the vanguard and that the entire state's army was behind him. While Albrecht was still positioning his troops, Ernst Casimir shot 4 salvos at the advancing battalions. It staggered them, for a moment. But then the Spanish realized they were only dealing with the vanguard and not the whole army. So instead of beginning the battle with the usual skirmishing and a forlorn hope, the pikemen would simply storm Ernst Casimir's position. This way, the cannons could be overrun with minimal casualties and allow the rest of the troops to cross the bridge and join the fight. Half an hour or so later, the Spanish attacked. They started on the left of Ernst Casimir to block the road to Ostend and Fort Albertus. Another group flooded the dike with overwhelming numbers and quickly captured Ernst Casimir's cannons. The state's troops stood their ground and shot at everyone coming their way. But then the Spanish cavalry emerged from the marshlands. That area was supposed to protect Ernst Casimir's right flank. When the Count saw them coming, he ordered the retreat, which went remarkably well, considering. The fight had lasted less than an hour, but Ernst Casimir hoped they had made their stand last long enough to help Count Maurits. The Roman Catholic sources and older history books report that the cavalry ran at the first Spanish advance, but considering what happened next and various reports to the contrary, this can't be correct. As Risoir's horsemen galloped around the Zeeland troops to cover their retreat, these men were startled and began to back up. The Scottish on the right, looking to their left, saw what they thought were panicky Zeelanders and started backing away as well. This quickly turned into a hasty retreat to the beach. There, the Spanish lancers had room to move. They chased a large group of Scots into the sea. Several hundred of them drowned, among them 7 captains. Another few hundred were captured in the dunes. If the Scots had backed into the dunes and made a stand there, they might have lived to fight another day, but we'll never know. The Zeelanders were more cautious in their retreat. They escaped in the direction of the Albertus fort, losing only 150 men and 2 captains underway. Some of the men in the fort panicked and ran away as well. They were promptly picked off by the Spanish cavalry. Had they just stayed put, they would have been fine. Albrecht was now in proud possession of the 2 cannons and 30 banners, including all the Scottish ones. In this short battle, Ernst Casimir had done something remarkable. He had rescued his officers, almost 3/4 of his infantry, and all his cavalry from an overwhelming force. Perhaps the Count had bought Maurits some precious hours. Now Albrecht had to get his army back in line and retrieve the cavalry that had enthusiastically chased the rebels all over the place, but he wasn't really sure what to do next anyway. Archduke Albrecht sent a message to Bruges and the Infanta that he had trapped Count Maurits with no way to escape. In Bruges, Ghent and other obedient cities, the church bells rang to celebrate this great victory. The Archduke felt triumphant, having destroyed the state's vanguard, but spent the next 2 hours talking to his commanders about what to do next. In Ostend, Count Ernst Casimir arrived to tell the States General about their defeat. The high and mightinesses saw their lives flash before their eyes. The Stadtholder would be defeated, and Ostend would come under siege. In short, everyone was trapped. All the politicians could do was pray, and pray they did. Please God, have mercy on these states. Take care of these Christians. And they told each other that they would never force Count Maurits to take on another dangerous mission if he didn't think it would work. Well, you should have thought of that sooner, smarty pants. In the Republic, Hohenlohe heard what had happened. He immediately directed his troops toward Flanders. Albrecht started his war room meeting at 8:30. They had 4 options. 1. Take a break, so the men can recover from the forced march and the battle at Mariakerke. 2. Retake Fort Nieuwendamme. 3. Retake Fort Albertus and cut off Maurits from his supply line and possible new troops. Basically, leave him out there to starve. Or 4. March straight on Newport and crush Maurits and the state's army completely. Mendoza, Sapena, and Bihar, the older and more experienced commanders, figured that Albrecht should stop, take a breath, and allow the troops some time to recover. It was gonna be a hot day. The soldiers were exhausted from their forced march, and they had just defeated the vanguard of Maurits' army. The younger commanders disagreed. La Barlotte argued Albrecht should not throw away his God-given shot to end the war with the most significant victory ever achieved by a prince or captain. The state's troops were obviously running scared now that the Spanish had already won their first victory. Don't allow the heretics any time to recover or prepare to defend themselves. Besides, Count Maurits had never fought a pitched battle, and all his field battles had been ambushes. He figured that just like the troops at the dike, the Stadtholder would take one look at the Spanish army and run, and since he had nowhere to run, it should be a hoot and a half. The older commanders told Albrecht to remember that desperate troops would get a boost of courage which would allow them to do the impossible. Desperate needs lead to desperate deeds. And on top of that, the heretic captains and soldiers were older and more experienced in warfare. Plus, they were with twice as many, or so they believed. Besides, some prisoners had told them that Hohenlohe had already arrived in Ostend. He hadn't. And then the battle would be fought on 3 fronts: at Nieuwpoort, at Fort Albertus, and at Ostend. And Albrecht only had 1 bridge in his back to make his retreat if things went south. But, the young gun said, a victorious general seized every opportunity when his soldiers were fired up and eager to win, and his opponent was confused. Anyone who dismissed such a chance would never recover from the shame of the missed opportunity. Remember, His Excellency had no more extra troops at his disposal. The heretics only needed 24 hours to get help from England or France. It was careless not to forge ahead with the victory already half secured. Albrecht wasn't sure, but while they were talking, the Spanish on the beach saw Dutch ships sailing past on their way to Ostend. They figured that the troops were in full retreat after they had heard of Ernst Casimir's defeat and that Count Maurits was already on board. Team Pro Battle became even more adamant, especially the mutineers demanded action. They had not joined the campaign to sit around and dig in the sand. They wanted to obliterate the States Army now. If they waited any longer, all the troops would be out to sea and whatever men were left would just surrender. Where's the fun in that? Spanish enthusiasm knew no bounds. They chanted the old charge, "Cuanto más moros, tanto más ganancia." The more Moors, the greater the spoils. This referred to the fact that early in the war, the rebels had proclaimed they'd rather be Turkish than Papist. Albrecht decided that they would use the apparent confusion of the reduced and leaderless States Army and charge. It was low tide, with a wide beach between them and Maurits, which allowed battle order. It was gonna be a walk in the park. Beach. Archduke Albrecht would attack and obliterate the States Army, but first it was time for some housekeeping. The Spanish army had to move right away before more of Count Maurits's men went out to sea, but part of Belasco's army was still marching from Oudenburg. The bridge needed to be secured. Belasco received the order to take 3 squadrons and 2 captured guns to protect the rear, guard the bridge and the baggage. Once the rest of his men arrived, he would have 2,000 men to defend a little but oh so vital bridge. They also had to do something about the many prisoners they had taken at Mariakerke. Albrecht didn't even think twice. The 5 captains and hundreds of prisoners were strangled or stabbed right there on the beach. No quarter for anyone. He then also decided that every member of the States Army would be put to death. Only 2 men would be given quarter, Count Maurits for his bravery and his brother Frederik Hendrik for his youth. They would be kept alive for a victory parade around Holland. Isabella was already thrilled about seeing the Nassaus on their knees before her. She fantasized about Maurits crying for mercy and that delicious young brother of his, how he would beg and beg. Her father had taught her well. At 10:30, the Royal Army and all the artillery had been brought across the dunes. Everyone was in battle formation, and Albrecht gave the order to advance. They had 4 miles to go. At 11 o'clock, Pedro Gallego and Juan Martinez were ordered to take 400 horse to go ahead, find the rebels, and start some fights. At about 2 miles out, these men caught sight of the States Army, standing in battle array on the beach. Rebels were not confused, not desperate, not leaderless, and with so many. Not one of them had gone out to sea. Oh shit.